Edward Blackwood was a name that resonated with quiet dread among the corridors of justice and whispered memories in the hushed interviews of forensic psychologists. In a sterile cell at HMP Pentonville, London, where the fluorescent lights cast unyielding shadows on his narrow window, Blackwood's story began with an unwavering clarity, a story etched in clinical observation and presented through the limited yet unrelenting perspective of his own recollections. His demeanor, meticulously detached, allowed him to recount the events that had led to his conviction for murder with an almost dispassionate narrative that unsettled even the most hardened investigators. He remembered an unremarkable childhood in the quiet suburb of Hertford, where the subtle cracks of a troubled home life bid him to observe the world with an analytical eye. Growing up under the stern yet indifferent tutelage of his parents, Thomas and Margaret Blackwood, Edward's early life was defined by a series of quiet disappointments, small betrayals, and an innate curiosity about the anatomy of human behavior. At school, while his peers discovered the joys of friendship and the transcendence of youthful exuberance, Edward found solace in studying forensic journals and psychological treatises, establishing a personal theoretical framework that would eventually unfurl into dark reality. The seed of detachment was sown early. In the midst of a summer in 1998 when Edward was only 17, an incident involving a long-forgotten classmate triggered a cascade of internal reflections. The boy who, by the authority of his own self-awareness, rejected the conformity of school, was left drowning in the silence of his own internal laws. For Edward, the ordinary boundaries of morality and empathy began to blur. He meticulously documented his thoughts in a journal, an unadorned record of observation and analysis that blended clinical detachment with an emerging dark purpose. Each entry, characterized by a sober accuracy, signaled the slow evolution of a mind that would later embrace the inevitability of calculated violence. By the time Edward reached his late 20s, his academic pursuits in criminology and psychology had afforded him a profound understanding of the mechanisms that drove individuals to deviate from the norm. London's bustling underground provided both the backdrop and the laboratory for his evolving worldview. In the crowded streets of Camden and the gloomy corners of East London, he quietly observed the interplay of power, fear, and desire. Yet he always maintained an emotional distance that bordered on the clinical, a detachment comparable to that of a scientist analyzing specimens under a microscope. On an overcast evening in November 2007, in the labyrinthine alleys of Manchester, Edward encountered Caroline Miles, a woman whose unsuspecting presence would serve as the catalyst for the most fateful decision of his life. Caroline, a gentle soul with unwavering optimism, had recently moved to the city to start afresh after a bitter divorce. In a chance encounter at a local bookshop on Deansgate, where the rustle of pages and soft murmurs of conversation mingled with the aroma of old paper, their paths converged. Although Edward was initially drawn to her vulnerability, a vulnerability that in his eyes represented a predictable human flaw, he soon regarded it as a statistical probability, an opportunity to perform an experiment on behavioral responses in an extreme circumstance. Over the ensuing weeks, Edward engaged Caroline in a series of dialogues that were marked by a clinical curiosity and a muted enthusiasm for uncovering the intricacies of her personality. Their conversations often took place on damp benches in Piccadilly Gardens or in the shadowed corridors of quiet cafes in the northern quarter. "You see," Edward explained in measured tones during one of their encounters, "human emotion operates with predictable patterns, much like variables in a controlled experiment. We are, all of us, resigned to the confines of our own limitations." Caroline, slightly bemused yet disarmed by the serene cadence of his voice, questioned, "Are you suggesting that our feelings are merely data points?" His reply was almost imperceptibly detached, "Indeed. When observed from a sufficiently objective standpoint, they are as ephemeral as the ink on these pages." It was precisely this conversation that planted the seed of his later actions, a dispassionate hypothesis that human life could be dissected, understood, and ultimately manipulated with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. In the weeks that followed, Edward's interest in Caroline deepened in an unsettling manner. He began meticulously studying her routine, her habits, and even the minutiae of her social interactions. His observations were noted in a series of neatly typed reports, each entry devoid of overt emotion yet filled with calculated determinations of risk and opportunity. One particular evening, on a damp night along the banks of the River Irwell, Edward invited Caroline for a quiet walk. The conversation that unfolded was laden with subtext, and while his words seemed neutral, a slow undertone of inevitability permeated his tone. "Do you ever consider that all relationships, no matter how profound, ultimately succumb to a natural decay?" he inquired, his eyes fixed on the dark ripples of the water. Caroline's tentative response, "I believe love and connection have a way to transcend decay, if given the chance to nurture them," was met with a measured pause. In that silence, Edward's mind was already racing through the possibilities, quantifying each nuance with a dispassionate precision that left no room for ethical intervention. As the months turned into years, Edward's internal calculus became increasingly complex, evolving into what he termed the inevitability equation, a disturbing formula that weighed individual traits, emotional output, and the societal impact of each action. To him, the world was a series of experiments waiting to be conducted. His solitary life, marked by meticulous notes, cold, methodical observations, and shadowed reflections, converged inevitably on a singular conclusion, that the controlled cessation of a life, when executed with precise calculation, could yield data that might illuminate the darkest aspects of human nature. In the clinical confines of his own private study, Edward assembled a dossier that detailed everything he had observed about Caroline Miles. The dossier was systematic, an assemblage of notes, photographs, audio recordings, and even transcripts of their conversations. Every item was catalogued with an almost ritualistic fervor. Over time, this accumulation of data transformed into a meticulously planned design, a design that culminated in an evening whose details he later recounted without any trace of passion or regret. The night that would forever mark the intersection of hypothesis and harsh reality unfolded in a grim industrial park on the outskirts of Manchester. The night was cool and silently indifferent, much like Edward's inner resolve. His target, Caroline, had been invited to a friend's gathering at an abandoned warehouse, a location chosen precisely for its isolation and the predictable flow of individuals. With a clinical precision reminiscent of a seasoned operative, Edward had orchestrated the circumstances so that each variable could be controlled, recorded, and later analyzed in the forensic laboratories of his own mind. In the moments leading up to the act, Edward's thoughts were not of remorse or despair but of detached calculation. He observed the interplay of shadows in the dim light, the randomness of human panic, and the subsequent efficiency of police response. As the confrontation began, his voice remained steady. "All data points have converged," he stated with an eerie calm while confronting Caroline in the deserted warehouse. Her voice, trembling with confusion and fear, managed to break through as she pleaded, "Please, Edward, what are you doing?" His reply was without emphasis, "I am merely fulfilling the parameters set forth by the variables of our existence." In a matter of minutes that would later be described in exhaustive detail in court transcripts and forensic reports, Edward carried out the act with a precision that was both methodical and disturbingly rational. The ensuing moments were a clinical observance of cause and effect, each breath measured, each action silently recorded in his extensive internal log. When it was over, the scene was left in a stasis of quiet horror. The lifeless body of Caroline lay amidst the industrial debris, and Edward, not as a man overcome by passion but as an observer concluding an experiment, stepped away with neither triumph nor despair. Within days, as the investigation unfolded across Manchester's labyrinth of surveillance and forensic analysis, detectives began to piece together the chain of events with unsettling clarity. Among those leading the inquiry was Detective Inspector Jonathan Hayes, a veteran of the Greater Manchester Police Force known for his analytical acumen. Hayes's reconstruction of the timeline and the subtle psychological nuances of the crime painted a picture that was as meticulously calculated as it was clinically detached. This was not a crime of passion, he later stated during a press briefing, but one orchestrated by someone who viewed his actions as an empirical study. During the trial, held in the imposing halls of Manchester Crown Court, Edward maintained his composed detachment. His defense was punctuated by detailed, impersonal accounts of his actions, carefully avoiding any admission of remorse. Throughout the proceedings, his statements were characterized by a clinical articulation of events, a narrative that both fascinated and repelled those who listened. His defense counsel, Mr. Richard Lawson, attempted to argue for diminished responsibility given Edward's psychological makeup, yet the weight of forensic evidence and the surgical precision of his planning left little room for mitigating circumstances in the eyes of the jury. In the courtroom, amidst the echo of measured testimonies and the steady tapping of typewriters recording every word, Edward's account of the events was delivered with an unnerving calm. "I observed the variables as they naturally converged to a point of inevitable conclusion," he stated during his testimony. Witnesses recalled his tone as devoid of any conventional emotional inflection. Even Caroline's closest friends, represented by the testimony of her lifelong confidant, Elizabeth Carter, could only describe the encounter as unsettling in its clinical precision. Elizabeth's tearful recollection of Caroline's unguarded trust only accentuated the gulf between the cold calculation of the murderer and the raw human agony left behind. After a deliberation that seemed almost interminable, the jury returned with a verdict that echoed the clinical precision with which Edward had conducted his life, a verdict of guilty. In his final statement, moments before sentencing, Edward's voice resonated with the same detached inflection that had defined his entire narrative. "The experiment is complete," he murmured softly, as if concluding an academic lecture rather than addressing a room of somber faces. The judge, in a measured tone, recited the sentence that would consign Edward Blackwood to a life behind bars, his actions forever encapsulated as an aberrant study in the darker recesses of human behavior. In the cold, sterile environment of his cell, Edward's thoughts turned once more to the intricate balance of variables that had led him to that fateful moment. Within the confines of introspection, he frequently revisited each calculated decision and meticulously recorded step with the precision of a researcher analyzing experimental data. His inner monologue was a relentless replay of statistical probabilities and psychological forecasts, a testament to a mind that could not reconcile the difference between observation and participation. "All actions are predicated upon cause and effect," he often reminded himself, the words a mantra that framed his existence in impersonal terms. The ensuing years saw Edward subjected to a series of psychological evaluations and interviews, each session dissecting his behavior in search of a motive that could be codified in clinical terms. Dr. Amanda Reynolds, a renowned forensic psychologist from King's College London, conducted numerous sessions with him. In one particularly detailed interview, she inquired, "Do you feel any remorse for the data that now represents a human life lost?" Edward's response, measured and devoid of conventional emotion, was, "Remorse is a variable irrelevant to the integrity of my study." The outcome was anticipated, and the results are, therefore, conclusive. His reply, delivered with an unnerving detachment, was analyzed by Dr. Reynolds over a series of sessions that meticulously charted the disconnect between human empathy and his cold, methodical reasoning. As months turned to years, the impact of his actions extended well beyond the confines of the courtroom and the prison walls. The forensic reports, painstakingly compiled by analysts in Manchester and London, became seminal studies in criminal psychology courses. Lectures in academic institutions dissected the methodology of his actions, referring to them as an extreme example of behavior that embraced empirical detachment over emotional engagement. Students, both fascinated and repulsed, frequently quoted passages from his own meticulously kept records, questions hammered out in seminars. Was Edward Blackwood merely a product of his environment, or did his actions represent an extreme divergence into a realm where morality was quantified and human life reduced to mere data points? In a rare instance of direct dialogue with the media years after his conviction, Edward was interviewed via a secure video link from his cell. The interview, conducted by journalist Michael Dawson in a subdued tone, was a study in the contradiction between language and emotion. Dawson questioned, "Do you believe that your actions were justified by this so-called inevitability equation?" Edward's response was a measured recitation of his observations. "Justification is not within the purview of my analysis. I simply recorded the outcome that the variables dictated." His gaze, fixed and clinical, offered no further elaboration, leaving the viewers with a chilling reminder of the gulf between human sentiment and calculated observation. Beyond the walls of incarceration, the case of Edward Blackwood initiated a broader dialogue on the nature of criminal behavior and whether the systematic, data-driven approach to understanding such behavior could ultimately serve as a deterrent or, paradoxically, as an inspiration for future acts of calculated violence. In academic conferences held in London's Bloomsbury and Manchester's modern seminar venues, experts from various disciplines debated the ramifications of his methods. When we reduce human emotions to a series of predictable outcomes, we risk sanitizing the very essence of moral responsibility, argued Professor Andrew Thompson of the University of Manchester during one such conference. The debate, though measured and clinical, underscored the inherent discomfort in confronting a reality where methodologies once reserved for scientific inquiry were applied to the darkest corners of human conduct. Throughout this period, Edward remained largely an enigma, his internal world inaccessible behind an unyielding veil of rationality. His interactions with prison staff were marked by the same clinical detachment that had defined his life. In routine conversations with Officer Samuel Wright, who patrolled the corridors of his cell block, Edward would occasionally comment on the predictable patterns of inmate behavior, remarking, "The routine, in essence, is the purest form of experimental control. Each day is a replication of variables that, when analyzed, provide insight into the human condition." Such statements, delivered without inflection, created an unsettling ambience among those who served and observed him. As the years bled into one another, the narrative of Edward Blackwood was gradually cemented in the annals of criminological studies, a case that continued to provoke questions about the intersection of information, emotion, and morality. His meticulously recorded journals were eventually smuggled out by sympathetic academics and published anonymously in scholarly journals. The work, while controversial, provided a rare glimpse into the inner workings of a mind that had compartmentalized violence as an element of empirical observation. Within these journals, laden with cold, precise language and punctuated by observations of both mundane and violent encounters, lay the story of a man who in a clinical sense had sought to understand the chaos of human error through the lens of systematic experiment. Yet, even as his writings became objects of study, the question remained, did the precision of his observations absolve him of responsibility, or did it further cement the inescapable reality of his choices? In a final interview recorded years later for an internal prison study, Edward was asked if he ever envied the spontaneity of a life unbound by such meticulous scrutiny. His response, as measured as his every other speech, was, "Spontaneity is unpredictable. In a world governed by data, predictability is the only constant." This statement, uttered in a monotone voice amidst a sterile room equipped with recording devices and clinical observation notes, brought home the disturbing conclusion that for Edward Blackwood, even the randomness of life was subject to the rigid parameters of scientific inquiry. On a cold winter morning in 2019, as fog enveloped the city of Liverpool and the River Mersey ran like a dark mirror to the industrial legacy of the region, Edward was seen through the narrow observation window of his cell contemplating the mundane passage of time. His thoughts, as captured in voice-recorded meditations monitored by prison psychologists, revolved around the inexorable nature of cause and effect. "Everything," he stated in an almost recited tone, "flows according to a definable sequence. A singular action, no matter how isolated it may seem, ripples through the fabric of existence." His words, clinical and devoid of conventional emotional depth, echoed in the hollow confines of his temporary abode, a stark reminder that for some, human existence could be reduced to data points in an unending experiment. Beyond his immediate environment, the legacy of his crimes continued to cast ripples across various strata of British society. In quiet suburban neighbourhoods of Surrey and the bustling financial quarter of the City of London, whispers of his case spurred debates over the nature of free will versus deterministic inevitability. Social commentators, legal experts, and even literary critics weighed in on the ramifications of a mind that treated murder as a calculable phenomenon. The narrative of Edward Blackwood, with its precise articulation of human behavior as observable and quantifiable, became a cultural touchstone, a macabre blend of fact and the abstraction of moral philosophy. One such dialogue unfolded in a televised roundtable discussion hosted from a London studio, where legal analyst Victoria Morgan and criminologist Dr. Peter Ellis clashed over the implications of Blackwood's case. If we view his actions through a purely scientific lens, argued Dr. Ellis, we run the risk of dehumanizing the very victims whose lives were extinguished by a calculated pursuit of knowledge. Victoria countered, but if the data is irrefutable, can we not say that his actions were simply an inevitable variable in a vast and indifferent system? The discussion, punctuated by paused reflections and clinical analyses of behavioral patterns, left viewers with more questions than answers, a testament to the complexity of reconciling cold, empirical evidence with the human capacity for emotion. In the years that followed, as Edward Blackwood's identity remained inextricably linked with the broader study of criminal psychology, the institution of justice itself found new avenues of introspection. Policymakers in Westminster began revisiting the fundamental principles of criminal responsibility and mental health, spurred by cases that challenged the conventional binary of guilt and empathy. In round-table sessions conducted in the austere chambers of the Houses of Parliament, experts debated extensively the potential benefits of integrating advanced forensic analytics into sentencing guidelines. "We must consider," declared one member, "that if a mind can reduce violence to a series of predictable outcomes, then our judicial approach must adapt to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of such calculations." Throughout these discussions, the figure of Edward Blackwood loomed large, not simply as a condemned murderer, but as an anomaly, a case study that compelled society to confront the limits of empathy when faced with extreme rationality. His own narrative, meticulously recorded and delivered in a tone that was simultaneously clinical and disconcerting, served as the foundation for a broader inquiry into the intricacies of the human condition. Even as textbooks and academic journals referenced his case as a rare instance of detached calculation, the memory of the victims, particularly that of Caroline Miles, served as a somber counterpoint. Friends and family members of those lost, from Caroline's sister Rebecca in Liverpool to her lifelong friend Mark Hampton of Manchester, reiterated in tearful interviews that behind every statistic, every calculated variable, lay a life irretrievably shattered. In the aftermath of his conviction, Edward Blackwood's life was reduced to a series of sterile observations and periodic interrogations by prison psychologists and criminologists determined to unlock the secrets of his detachment. His interactions were succinct, his words measured. "I do not regret what has transpired," he once commented during a monitored conversation, "for regret implies a flaw in prediction, a variable that does not alter the equation of cause and effect." This assertion, devoid of any discernible emotion, encapsulated the overarching narrative of his existence, a meticulous, clinical evaluation of life, stripped bare of sentiment. Even as the passage of time softened the immediacy of his crimes in public memory, within academic circles and forensic laboratories, Edward's case continued to be dissected with a rigor that was both imperative and unsettling. Annual symposiums revisited the cold logic that had driven him to transform a human tragedy into a subject of clinical investigation. His records, archived away in secure facilities at institutions like the University of Oxford and King's College London, were scrutinized for patterns that might elucidate the transition from observable behavior to irrevocable acts of violence. Notably, the reflective nature of his ongoing monologues captured in recorded sessions that spanned years revealed an individual who, while isolated by his barbaric choices, found solace in the absoluteness of data. In one such session, when prodded about the inevitability of his actions, Edward calmly replied, "In every human interaction there exists the potential for measurable outcomes. I merely engaged in an experiment where the hypothesis was confirmed by the irrevocable end of a life." His words, delivered with unwavering calm, ensured that the narrative remained impersonal, a recitation of facts rather than an outpouring of guilt or lament. Within the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the prison system and the corridors of academic inquiry, Edward Blackwood's name became synonymous with a disturbing new paradigm in how society measured the interplay of free will and determinism. Each interview, every forensic report, and the numerous academic papers that cited his case contributed to an evolving understanding of the potential dangers embedded in reducing human life to a series of predictable outcomes. His narrative, whether approached as a lesson in moral philosophy or as a forensic study, remained unequivocally fixed in the realm of the detached and the clinical, a reminder that some phenomena can never be reconciled with the warmth of human empathy. In the final analysis, the story of Edward Blackwood stands as both a grim case study and a cautionary tale. Through his own measured recounting, observers were forced to confront uncomfortable questions regarding the limits of rational behavior and the inevitability of human consequence. In an era increasingly fascinated by data and predictive analytics, his life and actions served as a stark illustration of the dangers inherent in divorcing empirical analysis from the messy, unquantifiable reality of human existence. Even as the institutional narratives and academic discourses continued to dissect his methods and motives, there remained an underlying current of unresolved questions surrounding the interplay between observation and participation. Was Edward merely an individual whose proclivities were shaped by a unique confluence of circumstances, or did his life represent a broader alarm, a forewarning that when human behavior is stripped of its emotional components, the resulting equation may yield consequences too horrifying to fully comprehend? The silence of the answers, inscribed in both the overflowing public records and in the guarded memories of those touched by his crimes, stood as a testament to the enduring mystery at the intersection of violence and cold calculation. As time marched inexorably onward and the cacophony of global discourse shifted to new focal points, the legacy of Edward Blackwood remained an indelible chapter in the study of aberrant human behavior. His archived journals, his recorded interviews, and the philosophical debates he unwittingly ignited coalesced around a single, immutable truth, that the clinical, detached narration of events, no matter how meticulously presented, could never fully encapsulate the profound tragedy at its heart. For every statistical analysis of his actions, there were lives disrupted, families shattered, and an indelible scar left on the tapestry of human experience, a scar that no formula or equation could ever hope to erase. This narrative, delivered in the clinical and impersonal tone of a meticulous record, stands not as an homage to cruelty but as an exploration of the darkest recesses of rationality gone awry. Every dialogue, every cold observation, and every meticulously planned action serves as a reminder of the disquieting potential that lies within the human psyche when it is unmoored from the ethical constraints of empathy and emotion. It is important to note that this entire narrative is a fictional tale and not based on actual events. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to my channel, like, and check the description to find out how you can support my work.